All right, thanks, Amber. Um, as Amber said, I'm David Thomas. Um, I'm a senior data project manager here at ICPSR. Hopefully you're in the right place. I'm going to cover subpopulations at ICPSR and the data we have. Um, so, you know, um, just to start out, I'll mention this periodically too, but I will share the slides, or we will share the slides. Somehow you can get the slides later, because like I'm gonna have links in there, so it might just be fun to, grab those slides later. I was probably supposed to share them earlier, but you know how things go. So anyway, so I'll get to that. Now I'm gonna attempt to share my screen, so bear with me. Um, and hopefully we'll have a nice journey together. Uh, all right, that's a good start. All right, here we go. All right, I think everyone's seeing it. The other funny thing, right, is like the transcript is working, so we all can see what I'm saying, but I'm easily distracted by looking at my own words, so we'll see how this goes too. All right, again, thank you. This is Data in Real Life, capturing the lived experience of subgroups in the US. I'm David Thomas, Senior Data Project Manager. Been here since like 2003 at ICPSR. So it's been a while. And so, you know, let's get started. All right, so agenda for today's talk, because I want you to know how we're gonna go, how this is gonna happen, right? We wanna have some comfort in knowing like where we're gonna start, where we're gonna end up, what you're gonna get. All right, so the goals and purpose, that's what to expect. Then I'm gonna have a special acknowledgement. I'm gonna have some where to look stuff, big studies, lots of data. You try to be creative with data stuff, right? And then like some areas of focus, and then questions and hopefully some answers. Um, yeah, so the goal, what I want you to get out of this, right? I want you, based on this, to kind of come away from this knowing a little bit of history on our efforts, ICPSR's efforts, toward what the new term is now, surfacing, but we really wouldn't call it surfacing, but highlighting, data on underrepresented populations. I'm going to use subpopulations, subgroups, and underrepresented populations kind of interchangeably, because that's how I talk. I want you to come away knowing about some of the data I highlight in this presentation. You're going to, based on it, you're going to know varying level degrees of information on these data, but you're welcome to go explore and figure these out. I hope that based on this, that you use these data, you tell other people about these data, and if you're working on these types of data, or you end up doing things with these types of data, or creating your own data set, that you also will contribute to ICPSR, to the broader field, and sharing your data. Sharing your data can be scary sometimes. It's highly unlikely you'll be scooped. Just want to put that out there. So, but data sharing is important because this is how we maximize the effects and the impact of data and research and all that. Hopefully also you'll come out of this kind of along the same lines, like you'll have some new interest. You're like, oh, I didn't know I could do that with this, or what about this? Or like maybe you had some old interests and you're like, a question here, but I don't think there's any data. Maybe you'll find out about some data that will be able to answer your question. And so those interests will be rekindled. It's fall, we're thinking about warmth and hearth. So rekindle kind of gets you that feeling. And then again, another goal is that I'm going to answer some questions. We're going to answer some questions. And then of course, another goal is that we stay within the time and everyone's still happy. All right, so why? Why might we do this? All right, so, again, please don't be distracted by my hands. I'm a hands talker. I'm trying to stay focused. Anyway, so why might we do this? We want to look at a particular group or have groups represented that are not just in comparison to groups in the majority, right? You want to be able to look within group and say oh, okay, well, this is how this group looks. So this is how this subgroup in this subgroup looks, right? Because the different populations, the different categorizations, they're not monoliths. They don't all function the same. They don't all think the same, because that's not how human beings are. You know, you look in any particular family, you're going to find a bunch of differences. You broaden that group, you're going to find even more differences and more differences and more differences, right? So you might be able to look at things like, okay, well, given this socioeconomic classification or level, that this subgroup looks different than the same subgroup, but with a different socioeconomic status or level, something like that. And so being able to pull those apart, tease those apart, that's why we want these data. This is why we use these data. This is why it's important to have these data, right? We also want to be able to make conclusions about a group with solid evidence and data. I bring this up because when I first heard about it, it's called we don't want to do the guy who approach, right? And so now we might say person who, but the guy who approaches this, right? So you're out there, you're bringing your full data. You're like, oh, I have these data and I have this conclusion and I'm bringing this and I'm bringing that. And then there's always someone who's like, well, I know a guy who blah, 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 blah. And they try to use that as some sort of like pushback or refute to what you're saying, right? And by having data, we avoid the guy who, because now we have multiple people and we're like, well, that's nice that a single, now, okay, we always want to be polite and not condescending, right? But, you put it in a way that you don't want to have that more, what we might call anecdotal research. Anecdotal research can be a good start, but then the anecdotal research can help phrase your question or make the question. But then you want to bring the data to it and bring the research and say like, okay, and this is what happened, right? Whether or not it confirms your theory or not, you want to have that information there to figure that out. And, it's important to know so that we can learn more and do more. All right, so the groups I'm going to focus on, right, for this presentation are categories of racial and ethnic identity, gender identity, sexual orientation. All right, so that's kind of where this is figured. You could look at a lot of different groups and categories. I had to narrow it down. One of the nice things, having done this for a while now, and I mean over the years, is that over time, I'm having to narrow down what studies I bring in. And that's a great thing. It can be when you're building a presentation like this, you're kind of like, oh, but that's fantastic, because that means that more data is being produced and more data are being shared. And that's fantastic because that gives us a broader range of data to pull from. And that means it's having an effect and people are using data, thinking of new questions. That's fantastic. Now, it's not going to be the same across all the categories. We're going to see some differences in the number of slides dedicated to different groups. And some of that is indicative on areas where we need maybe more research, more data sharing. So we'll see. All right, but first, a few things. Now, special recognition. So, as we talk about subpopulation research, and as we talk about, these ideas of within groups and comparisons and stuff like that, we have to talk about James Jackson. He's a former ISR director. He is responsible for the Program for Research on Black Americans, the National Survey of American Life, National Survey of Black Americans. He was also heavily involved with an American Psychological Association, a group of studies called Stress in America, that again is looking at stressors of minority populations. And so and as ISR director, right, he was instrumental in supporting RCMD, both through as the director, but also previously, like a lot of his data are shared with ICPSR. He gave us leads and stuff like that. So very influential, very important. Was innovative in this research on the influence of race on the health of African Americans, right? the surveys he was involved with, you know, extensive social, economic, mental, physical health surveys of the Black population. And then people use those to look at Latino populations, Asian American populations, stuff like that. Building the framework for understanding racial and ethnic disparities across the lifespan. And then when you're doing like these types of things, you find out things you didn't know. So here are some things I learned. So when he was a graduate student, he disrupted the presidential address of the APA to demand more support for Black psychology students. And then since, you know, no good deed, he then became the president of the Black Student Psychological Association. And almost 50 years ago, he was the first full-time African-American faculty member at the University of Michigan. The University of Michigan is pretty big. All right, so where to look? All right, so you might start with, and sorry, there wasn't more of a pause, but we got to get in there. I work at ICPSR, so I'm going to say start with ICPSR, right? So start with ICPSR. Go to the homepage, type in, you know, search terms. ICPSR, the homepage of ICPSR will get you to all the archives. It's fantastic, you know. And then as you narrow things down, you can go to specific archive, specific series, specific study. But start there. You can look at a word cloud. You can browse by collections, stuff like that. You can get all this great stuff. It's great. So start there. Now, like I said, I'm with the Resource Center for Minority Data, so I'm going to also say go to the Resource Center for Minority Data. These are like the bigger picture kind of things, like where to start. All right, you know, we're member funded. You know, if you're at a membership institution, you know, we're one of the values of membership. You know, it says over 2,000 studies in our holding and growing, right? And it can take you to the rest of the ICPSR holdings, as with pretty much any other of our archives. A few others, though, right, is our demographic archive, so DSDR. Then our aging archive, or archive on aging, that's NACDA. And then our HIMCA archive, funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And then our Criminal Justice Archive, NACJD. These are all places you might look. I mean, and there's a lot of other ones too, that's so you look across the collection. I want to bring to your attention, as we're talking about subpopulations, some cross-category options, some larger studies. If you remember from my agenda, I talked about, I don't remember what I called it, big data, lots of uses or something like that. And so two that I'm going to highlight relatively quickly, right, is the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, BRFIS, right? Again, this is US residents looking at health-related behaviors, health conditions. Started with 15 states, now it collects data in all 50 states, right, and US territories. So you have this, like, you know, it's national, it's big. You have decades of data to do comparisons. It's well documented. You get questions on race and ethnicity. You get gender identity questions in the more recent versions of these surveys, and you get sexual orientation questions. You know, and so that one hits all three of the categories I'm going to focus on right now. So that's just a good one. Now, you know, with anything with government data, you know, it's a good stop. It's a good site. You know, here's a picture of it. You know, it's stable. There is some learning curve. You know, you'll have to learn some things, but that's a fun way to go about learning new procedures and stuff like that. It's because, you know, there are a group of people who have done this before and who know this. So, you know, you could use web searches and Google to figure all this out. You know, or also books and articles, all those things too. You can do a lot of things. Anyway, the other one, right, is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, NHANES. Again, nationally representative sample, looking across demographic, socioeconomic categories, you know, medical, dental, physiological measurements, and they're like sub-surveys, all this information that you can get. And it's 2-year intervals, so you might look at the data, but say something like, you know, 2015, 2016, 2008, 2009, multiple years of data, you know, at least 20 years. Again, well documented. You have race and ethnicity questions, sexual orientation questions, and for those people looking into like other types of health behaviors, sexual behavior, it has detailed sexual behavior questions so that you can bring that, and look at those differences and everything like that, as we kind of, I want to hit like, so this is just a very rich data source. A few years ago, many years ago now, people used to use the word robust a lot, like it's a robust data set. So this is a robust data set. We like robustness. And evidently I just like saying robust, right? Anyway, now we're going to look at the race and ethnicity category, right? And so, as I mentioned, RCMD, and I mentioned the Program for Research on Black Americans, this is where we're going to start. Earlier, so I checked the date to make sure. So it's not earlier this summer, but now earlier in the year in the summer, the ICPSR summer program, their BLALEC lectures were all online. And one of the ones that was done was the Research on Black Americans and Archive Data at ICPSR. This is a wonderful video, Dr. Robert Taylor giving you the history behind the Program for Research on Black Americans in particular, like what was done, the challenges they face now, the challenges they still face in getting their data published and getting their findings published, and the things that come out of that, some of that, person who pushback and stuff like that. And so this is, when you get my slides, if you choose to get my slides, you don't have to get my slides. You can go on YouTube and look this up. But watch this. I was there for it because I was part of it. My part's at the end. You can stop before you get to my part. I don't care. You don't hurt my feelings. But listen to just the history. It's such a rich history of data and the whole process. And you're reminded that like this wasn't like, this isn't ancient history. This is recent history of what people are doing. And you think about like, this is the first, they'll say things like the first survey that did it, and that was like 1988. And you're like, wow, I remember 1988. So this isn't a long time ago. And so, just a wonderful video, just another example of another way to approach this, being provided by ICPSR, and just all of this. A study to focus on, or which is a group of studies, is the CPES. I would read it out loud, but every time I get to epidemiology, I get caught up once I start with the word psychiatric. So it's on there, you can read it. All right, so in this, you have the National Survey of American Life, and there are multiple types of that survey. There's like an adolescent sample, there's restricted data in there, there's a National Latino Asian American Study, NLAS, and then there's this National Comorbidity Replication Survey. On the ICPSR site, these studies and a few more fall into what's called the National Comorbidity Series. And so they're listed in there. You can look at those. And that's one place to find data on one type of racial ethnic subpopulation. Another one, a recent release, is the Health and Life Study of Koreans, HLSK. Right, it's a web survey to examine the health of foreign-born Korean American adults living in LA County and the state of Michigan. This is, at least in the holdings of RCMD, ICPSR, finding information on Asian Americans and studies on Asian Americans, it's less prevalent. We also have the National Asian American Surveys, which are focused on politics. And so you might check those out as well. But, and then but the difference being, like I just said, the Asian American Survey versus this study focused on Koreans in particular, right? And so now you're looking at, with, a group within a group, and you're looking at, okay, well, how does this group, how do Koreans, how might they differ from Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans? And then ICPSR, being a large organization, we actually have two studies that are called FACES. You can imagine internally, at a place with so many acronyms and initials, it's not uncommon to be using the same word to be talking about two totally different things, and sometimes that causes confusion. I wanted to bring this up because I've had that experience. Anyway, so we have the Filipino American Community Epidemiological Study, FACES. This is from about 15 years ago, but still, for looking at Filipino Americans, this is still relevant because at least I did a quick search. I'm not seeing a lot of shared data on this. So this is a study of alcohol and stress-related behaviors of Filipino Americans in the San Francisco Bay Area and the city and county of Honolulu. So that's one place to look. So a little bit older data. One of the things that came up in that YouTube video about the Program for Research on Black Americans is like a lot of times people will say, well, these data are old. I want newer data, And the unfortunate thing is sometimes, yes, these data are old, but these also might be some of the more current data. That's one of the places where we're like, oh, well, we need more data in this area, And so when you're looking at that and you can say stuff like, well, but, and if a reviewer says or something like, well, these are old data, you're like, well, that is true. That is what it is. This is where we are. If you know of another data source, I'm happy to know. But when you're pulling things apart, this is what you get sometimes. Another FACES is for the Family and Child Experiences Survey. This is by Head Start. And so this is a nationally representative sample of survey started in 1997, right? But historically, it's not including programs designed to serve American Indian and Alaska Native children and families. And so, this one's 2015, so you have this survey as well. And so, having done this a while, this is something I wanted to bring up to people's attention because this is 2015. But again, we want to look at these experiences, look at the subpopulation, highlight it, so people know what's going on. You're like, oh, okay, well, that's that. Now let's focus and move to gender identity. In our holdings, we have fewer studies on this. So one study is the 2015 U.S. Transgender Survey. It's conducted by the National Center for Transgender Equality to look at the experiences of transgender adults in the U.S. You have respondents from all 50 states. And you have 27,000 respondents. So that's a solid, going back to that word, right? A robust survey. And it's looking at experiences of transgender people across a wide range of issues, like just living life issues, right? Education, employment, family life, health, housing, interactions with, authority, police, prisons. It is restricted access, so you have to go through a process to get access to these data. That's one. Another one, again, some of the newer, some of the older, is the Virginia Transgender Health Initiative Study, conducted in 2005, 2006. This just focuses on Virginia, much smaller analytical sample, but still something to look at. I can't say that you should use them, you can't like make exact comparisons, but you can see some of the differences and maybe some of how the questions were asked, some of the information given, the experiences, all of that. So it's worth noting as you're talking and thinking about, looking at these different subpopulations and tackling these questions in different ways to figure this out. In this area, we have more data on the way. And so we're really excited about this, that we're getting more studies on transgender populations. We're getting state level surveys of transgender populations, fingers crossed, right? And we're interested in getting comparison studies, comparing cisgender and transgender populations as the purpose, like purposely comparing cisgender and transgender populations to look at those in that way. And they go like, oh, okay, well, that's what we're gonna do. I want to make a plug for the next Data Fair session based on that, right? Because the next Data Fair session, quantifying gender identities and behavior, is going to look at the challenges in creating gender inclusive categories, and some of these key issues. So if you signed up for this, hopefully you're going to attend the next one too. I'm going to try and attend it. And so, so you find out more about this because it's really fun to learn about, things that you're not, it's fun to learn about things that you don't actually have to like have all the answers to and ask all the questions. You can just learn from someone else and you're like, oh, well, that's interesting. And even if you're not really interested in that population, right, it can spur some of the ideas to think, well, how can I use this for the areas I'm interested in? And oh, I didn't think about that when I'm designing my own questionnaire or my own instruments and stuff like that. Now let's go into sexual orientation. I don't have transition slides, transitions in PowerPoint. Sometimes I don't get them, I screw them up, so I don't do it, right? But, here's some other new studies, right? Generations, this is another recent release. A study of the life and health of LGB people in a changing society. Since this is a recent release, I just decided to throw a screenshot of the study homepage right on there because I felt like it. Also because this is an example of something that was a cross-archive collaboration between DSDR and RCMD, and looking at and having a relationship with the PI, principal investigators, and the funding and the archive funded by their funders and stuff like that. So it examines health and well-being across 3 generations. Again, rich, robust, lesbians, gay men, and bisexuals, 5-year study, multiple waves, exciting stuff, lots there. Looking at, younger cohorts compared to older cohorts and how they view their identity and their experiences and their stress and, discrimination, and getting all of that as you're pulling that in, and you're like, okay, so then you can look at resilience, right, within a community between cohorts. So that's really cool. And then we have another one coming, a little bit older, Project Stride, Stress, Identity, Mental Health, New York City. Looking at stress and minority identity related to sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, and gender on mental health, right? The social stressors that get involved in figuring all that out and dealing with, living your lived experience, right? So your lived experience is always shaped by who you are. And that's just how that works. And so these questions are designed to figure that out and to get to those points and go, oh, okay, well, that's what that is. Here's another plug, because I got time, is the Williams Institute. Both of those studies I mentioned are coming out of the Williams Institute at UCLA. And they're doing independent research on sexual orientation and gender identity, and as affected by law and public policy, right? And so they're doing good work. And again, they're willing to share their data. And we're trying to get these things out there so that people can do research. Because sometimes, depending on your question, right, you don't have the funding or the wherewithal or whatever it may be to field your own study. Secondary data is a wonderful way. I work at ICPSR, I'm going to think this, to do that, to maximize data, to look at it in a new way. Also, RCMD has started to create, this is our first pass at it, and we're going to update it, but we have an LGBTQ resource guide that looks at that. It's a downloadable spreadsheet at this point, but it has the questions that were used in some of these surveys. It looks at, you can do comparisons about how people asked about, SOGI questions, sexual orientation, gender identity. Was it a combined question? Was it a specific question? How did the Burfus do it versus the N. Haynes? How did Stride do it versus generations? Looking at these things, making the comparisons, seeing differences in time. You can do all those things to be better prepared and to, again, have a better experience and to make for better results. Yeah, I knew it. So I was trying to go slow, and then I went, this is exciting stuff for me. So hopefully what we have is some questions. I saw some Q&A stuff. It's funny, I'm not gonna riff, but there's so much you could find. I chose some studies. There's so much you could do. I could add a lot more. One other thing I like to mention when talking about subpopulations is a relatively recent study that didn't make the cut. We're still kind of working some bugs out about it. But in the Arts Archive, NADAC, there's a study that's looking at, it's by Catherine Dunham. And I'm not into dance history. I didn't know about this, but it looks at over time, like basically in the 50s, African American dancers and where she traveled, Catherine Dunham, where she traveled and her experiences and observations and everything like that. And so when it looks at, you might not think to look in an arts archive for data on, a subgroup, but yet there you go. And, this is a really big contribution, we think, to the data field and to the arts research field. Let me, okay, so let me stop sharing. And we have time. Looks like there's chat and everything.
Mm-hmm. I can read those out to you, David.
Wonderful.
Okay. That was an awesome presentation. I work at ICPSR and I learned quite a bit about what we have from this presentation. So thank you. I'll start with the first one that came in, and it's from a PhD student. And she wants to know a little bit about restricted data and why data is restricted and why does it take long for it to be shared when it is restricted data.
Let's see, those are multiple questions. Restricted data, let's go backwards. Why does it take longer? Because there's a process. And there's, what we're looking at for restricted data, we have a lot of concerns about the population and about the respondents. Also, what we're talking about is coordination between multiple entities. And so, these are agreements, legal agreements about data sharing. And so what's involved are, home institution legal entities making agreements. So it's not agreement between like ICPSR and an interested user. It's an agreement between that person's home institution and the University of Michigan on behalf of ICPSR. And things have to happen so that we need to make sure that you have the data security protocols in place. We need to make sure that you have, all the people at an institution who can be involved in signing off on it and saying, yes, we commit to protecting these data in this way and to monitoring for correct usage and for compliance. And like I said, I mean, the reason why restricted data, many times why data are restricted is because, there's some possibility of those data where with those variables included, you could have possible respondent disclosure or identification, stuff like that. So, yeah.
Got it. Awesome. So a few folks joined a little late, it looked like. So can you tell us what you do here at ICPSR and a little bit about your role and position here?
Oh, well, so I didn't really say anything about that. So it's okay that you were late, those people. I'm a data project manager here at ICPSR. Right now I work on the Resource Center for Minority Data. I'm working on, I've been with that since like 2006, 2007, either way over 10 years. I started as a person who does the data conversion, what we now call a data curator. Then I was what we will call a curation supervisor, then a hybrid role, and then we pulled things more out. So we have like supervisors and project managers, and I also, what do you call that thing? Exhibit at conferences, sometimes do presentations there. I'm one of the people who, has been on the road show with Linda, to all sorts of interesting places, and experiences. So yeah, that's who I am. That's what I am.
Gotcha. Thank you. Can you give advice on the best way to ask for race and gender data? We're concerned about the effects on those being asked.
Can I give advice? I mean, so the quickest advice would be like, yeah, use secondary data so you don't get that fatigue. But that's a very real thing that people talk about, right? Respondent fatigue. Um, you know, um, so that's not my area of expertise at all. Um, I'm on the other end of it. So the biggest advice, the best advice I think I could give would be that there are a lot, right, in particular in this point in time, many people talking about how to ask these questions. Many of these webinars are free, um, to either email people who are doing that, maybe go to that program of research on Black Americans, looking up things like that. Go to ask questions about, the Williams Institute, because again, it might not be that they're looking at the same groups you're looking at, but they might have still wonderful ideas and ways to go about this. Again, like the government data I mentioned, highlighted, might be a good place as well to look at some of the questions that people are using, and how they're phrasing it to somewhat reduce the fatigue, but also to make sure you're not framing your question, while you might have good intentions, in a way that upsets your intended population. Um, as we're developing better terminology and better ways to, talk about subpopulations, we have better wording. The wording we might have used when I was first starting college is very different than wording we'd use now in terms. And so make sure, if that's not your area. Oh, the other thing that anyone would say would be to not just do what's called kind of drive-by research, right? If this isn't your area, talk to the experts in this area. Talk to respondents, work with community organizations, who can, maximize your survey, who can get your information out to the communities, who can work with you, and who can give you feedback on what you're asking, to reduce that fatigue, to, maybe, and if it's not reducing it, it's buffering it, because you're creating a sense of investment in your respondent populations. That's what I would say.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to read off maybe two more. And if I don't get to your question, I apologize, but we will keep track of them and try to respond to all of those via email. David, do you know of any data that might be housed in RCMD that includes the subgroup of African Americans, Caribbean Americans, and first generation Africans?
Maybe. I would look at the National Survey of American Life, and I would be on the lookout for a particular Caribbean population study of the National Survey of American Life. It's not out yet, but we're trying to get it out. That might handle that. But I would stay in that. That's where I would probably look, in that Survey of American Life. Start there. A program research Black Americans, and then also going out. Start there, and then so many people have been through that program that now you have people who started at, who were students there and postdocs and everything, but now they're doing work, at Harvard, in California. Yeah, so like start there, and then sort of like, track the research, if you will, right? it's almost like I don't know the term, but like a center, a node, and then like, all the different, a spider web of race research, so you see all the connections and it can be really fun. And then, you can have your own light board and yarn, but whatever, go on. Mhm.
Awesome. How about American Muslims? Have you seen any data on that?
Oh, I haven't, I don't think, but that is a good uh, pull in for, even though I haven't seen the data, that doesn't mean it's not out there. The Pew Center, I think, has some Muslim surveys, and I think you can find them at the Pew Center, but also at the ARDA, the ARC. Okay, I call it the Religious Archive, but it's called the ARDA, ARDA. Go there. You also might try the Roper Center. Um, you know, of course, start with ICPSR. But also we do have the Detroit Arab American Survey. That's a different group, but there might be some overlap in that group with that question. And the Detroit surveys, also with the DMACS, the Detroit Metro Area, it's DMACS. Those are, again, recent releases from ICPSR. You might look there too. So evidently I did have some answers.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. So do you have any, lastly, I think this might be our last question. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my clock. Do you have
Mhm.
recommendations for looking at housing inequality, residential segregation, and insecurities among subgroups?
I would probably, again, not my area, I'd probably look at American housing surveys. Um, that's what I would do. But again, it's not my area. So that's where I would start. AHS, it's like Burfus, so like, many time periods, longer study. Now these bigger government data studies, you do need to do some research about what you're trying to compare, and what design variables like weights and stuff like that you need to use for accurate estimates. So if you're trying to get national estimates versus just sample estimates, stuff like that, but there's still a lot of research and a lot of good documentation on how to do that. So you're not alone. And a lot of people know and are willing to answer your questions.
Awesome, awesome. One more. What data set do you recommend that addresses mental health of subpopulations?
Depending on what you want, I might go with Stress in America. Project Stride was another one. Um, the comorbidity surveys. Um, Possibly Burfus. I've never looked at Burfus for that. Um, if you're looking at younger groups, the youth behavior risk surveys, YBRS, or I can't say it, YBRS. It's YBRSS, I believe. So yeah, I might start there.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you all who attended today. I really appreciate your comments and your questions. And as I mentioned prior, we will collect these and try to answer them all via email. This webinar was recorded, and we will share the recording as well as the slides with you via email also. So thank you so much again. And along with David, I second that. Please attend the next webinar. That one is also very good about subpopulations, and I think you'll enjoy that one as well. So thank you again, David, and thank you for all who joined. Bye-bye.